February 1942. The Arctic Ocean was a living thing, gray, cold, and cruel. The convoy, codenamed PQ-12, pushed north of Iceland into weather so violent that waves tore lifeboats from their davits. On the decks of the merchant ships, ice grew inches thick, freezing gun crews into statues. Somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon of sleet, German reconnaissance planes were watching. The Murmansk run, as the sailors called it, was the most dangerous shipping route on Earth. Out of every 100 men who sailed it, nearly 20 never came back. They didn't drown quietly. They burned, frozen in oil fires that spread across water cold enough to kill a man in 60 seconds. Among the escort fleet assigned to PQ convoys that winter was a man who didn't quite fit in uniform. Sergeant William Hanley had been a civilian truck driver before the war, hauling convoys up the Alaska-Canada highway through ice storms and avalanches. When the Army Transport Command began coordinating supply runs with the Navy, they borrowed men like Hanley, drivers, riggers, mechanics, to help plan logistics. Hanley wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the bridge of a warship, but by a strange chain of postings, he ended up aboard the escort vessel USS Ingraham as an Army liaison observer. His job was simple: track cargo tonnage and delivery timetables. But Hanley was the kind of man who couldn't stop noticing patterns. From the bridge, he watched the convoy crawl through the gray light. 42 merchant ships, spread in a tight rectangular grid, 10 cables apart, plowing through the same patch of sea. To an admiral, it looked orderly. To a trucker, it looked like a death trap. He'd seen this before on frozen roads in Alaska. When one truck broke traction on ice, it wasn't just one vehicle that went over the cliff. It was every truck following too closely, all chained together by routine and fear. Out here, he thought, the ocean was doing the same thing. One ship took a torpedo, panic followed, and before escorts could maneuver, the whole formation was scattering into chaos, making them easy prey. That night, he mentioned it quietly in the wardroom. "You ever notice," he said, "how we move like a parade instead of a convoy?" The junior officer beside him laughed. "That's the point. Discipline keeps us alive." Hanley didn't press it, but he wrote the thought in his notebook. He drew 2 diagrams, one of the current box formation, another with each column offset by time rather than distance, like a staggered line of trucks switching lanes to dodge potholes. It was crude, drawn in pencil on a page stained with coffee, but it described something new: rhythm as defense. The next morning, U-boats found them. At 0320 hours, lookouts aboard the freighter Empire Comet spotted a periscope breaking the surface. The alarm sounded across the convoy. Within minutes, 2 torpedoes struck Empire Comet amidships. She went down in flames so bright they lit the snow on surrounding ships. The escorts rushed to counterattack, dropping depth charges into the boiling wake. But by the time the smoke cleared, 2 more ships were gone. In total, 4 merchantmen sank before dawn. When it was over, Hanley stood by the rail, staring at the empty patch of ocean where Comet had been. He turned to the ship's executive officer and said quietly, "They don't even have to aim at us. They just aim at where we'll be next." The officer didn't respond, but a few weeks later, when Ingraham returned to Scapa Flow, that same notebook somehow ended up in a pile of convoy debriefs bound for Admiral Sir Max Horton's staff in Liverpool. At that point, Horton was still new to his command as the head of the Western Approaches, the vast Atlantic zone where every Arctic convoy passed. He was a submariner himself, blunt and fearless, with a reputation for ignoring protocol when common sense offered better odds. What caught his attention wasn't the handwriting, it was the perspective. The report didn't sound like a sailor's. It sounded like a man who'd spent years keeping vehicles alive on frozen mountain roads. Horton read the line twice. Convoy loss is not caused by being found. It's caused by moving predictably after being found. By March, Convoy PQ-13 would sail into another storm, and this time Horton would test something quietly, without telling the Admiralty. The idea came from an unlikely place, a truck driver's sketch of staggered timing. The next convoy left Reykjavik under skies that looked carved from slate. PQ-13, 24 merchant ships, 3 destroyers, and 6 smaller escorts, carried everything from aircraft fuel to ammunition destined for Murmansk. The route north past Bear Island was a graveyard of steel. In the last 4 months alone, U-boats and bombers had destroyed more than 100 Allied ships along this corridor. The Admiralty had blamed weather, coordination, even luck. But Admiral Max Horton was looking for pattern, and that meant data. Horton's staff had spent weeks analyzing reports from earlier convoys. Losses weren't evenly distributed. They clustered. 2 or 3 ships struck within minutes, then nothing for hours. The attacks came when convoys bunched up, when ships slowed to reform or followed the same wake. The Germans didn't have to find all the ships. They only had to calculate rhythm. Horton's background as a submarine commander told him what that meant. The enemy wasn't guessing. They were timing. That's when a young logistics aide dropped a bundle of Army debriefs on his desk. Among them was a brief typed summary titled Observations by Sergeant William Hanley, U.S. Army Transport Command, PQ-12. Horton read it twice. The language was clumsy, but the logic was brutal. Hanley compared convoy formation to truck lines on mountain roads. Rigid spacing meant shared risk. A torpedo run is like a skid, he wrote. If you steer the same way, the next man goes over the same edge. Horton summoned his navigation officer, Commander Edward Barstow. Barstow, he said, tapping the page, what if the columns didn't all march in step? What if they zigzagged out of phase? Barstow frowned. Sir, we'd lose cohesion. Horton replied, we're losing ships, not cohesion. Try plotting it. They spread charts over the table. Instead of 10 columns with synchronized turns every 4 minutes, the standard convoy pattern, they offset each column's zigzag by 30 seconds. That meant at any given time, the convoy's shape was never the same twice. Submarine fire control, which relied on predicting course and speed, would now face a moving target that refused to line up. Horton called it rhythmic staggering. Barstow called it lunacy. But Horton approved a trial anyway. Meanwhile, at Scapa Flow, Sergeant Hanley's posting had ended. He was due to return stateside, but a message intercepted him. Report Liverpool, Western Approaches Command. He assumed it was a clerical error. When he arrived, an officer handed him a cup of tea and said, Admiral Horton wants to talk about your trucks. Hanley walked into the office, still wearing his oil-stained field jacket. Horton motioned to the chart table. You're the fellow who thinks we should drive convoys like convoys? He asked. Hanley nodded. Sir, if you keep every ship in lockstep, one lucky submarine can line up 4 torpedoes and hit 3 of them. But if every column's dancing to a slightly different rhythm, they've got to guess twice. The ocean's big. Make them guess. Horton smiled faintly. You understand this isn't a highway, Sergeant? Hanley replied, Neither's Alaska in winter, sir. It wasn't official policy. It wasn't even written down. But when PQ-13 left port that March, its columns were ordered to maintain slight time offsets between course changes. To the men on deck, it just felt disorganized. A convoy writhing like a wounded snake. The U-boats circling below thought the same thing. They couldn't get a proper firing solution. 2 days out of Iceland, radar picked up a German reconnaissance aircraft shadowing the convoy. Normally, that meant an attack within hours, but when the U-boats arrived that night, they found no clear formation. Their commanders' reports, captured after the war, tell the story. Convoy courses irregular. Difficult to calculate angle on the bow. Several ships appear to overlap bearings. The Germans fired torpedoes. Most missed. Only one merchant ship was hit that night. The next morning, escort destroyers caught a periscope at 800 yards and dropped a depth charge pattern that destroyed U-655 outright. In the chaos, Hanley stood on the bridge beside Barstow, watching plumes of water rise in the half-light. He said quietly, "That's one less skid." Barstow didn't understand, but Horton did when the reports came in. PQ-13 had lost just 2 ships out of 24. The previous convoy had lost 6. A 60% improvement from a notebook sketch. But the story wasn't over. Horton wanted to know why it worked. He ordered his analyst to reconstruct submarine attack geometry from intercepted German messages. The answer was as simple as it was devastating. Rhythmic staggering broke predictive algorithms. Every submarine captain who aimed ahead of the convoy now found the target missing by the time his torpedoes arrived. For Hanley, it should have ended there. Instead, Horton called him back. "You ever been to Murmansk?" Hanley shook his head. "Then you're going again. This time, I want you to see your idea from the inside." The next convoy, PQ-17, would test his theory on the deadliest stage of the Arctic. July 1942. Convoy PQ-17 assembled off Valfjordur, Iceland. 35 merchant ships and their escorts, bound for Arkhangelsk, through waters patrolled by over 24 German submarines and shadowed by long-range bombers from Norway. The men on board knew the odds. They'd heard the rumors. PQ-13 had made it, but barely. The Arctic route had already swallowed hundreds of ships. The Navy called it the Murmansk Run. The sailors called it the Meat Grinder. Sergeant William Hanley had no business being there. He wasn't Navy, and he wasn't a sailor. But Admiral Horton had insisted. "You built this system," he'd said. "Now see how it holds." Hanley was assigned to the freighter Samuel Chase, one of the Liberty ships carrying trucks and ammunition. His quarters were cramped and unheated, a steel box below deck that shook every time the ship's propeller turned. He carried with him a single notebook and a worn compass from his driving days. For the first 4 days, the Arctic looked deceptively calm. The convoy steamed northeast under a low gray ceiling of fog, ice forming on the rails, crews hacking at it with axes to keep the ship from toppling. The fleet's columns were offset, a controlled stagger that kept each ship slightly out of sync. To an observer above, the formation looked irregular, almost chaotic. But the rhythm was deliberate, each captain turning his wheel at slightly different intervals. On the bridge of Samuel Chase, Hanley watched the compass repeater sway. "Feels strange," the captain muttered, "like we're drunk." Hanley replied, "That's how the Germans feel too, sir." It was a fragile confidence. On the evening of July 4th, German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy near 75 degrees north latitude. Within hours, U-boats began to converge. The first attack came just after midnight, torpedoes streaking through water black as iron. The Navarino took a direct hit and went down in minutes. But when the U-boats tried to reload, they found their targets gone. The convoy had shifted bearing and spacing during the attack window. The old firing tables, built for fixed-pattern convoys, no longer worked. What Hanley couldn't know from the deck was that Admiral Horton's experiment had divided the German wolf packs. The radio intercepts that night, later recovered from Bletchley Park's ultra-decrypts, show commanders arguing over positions. "Convoy moving erratically," one message reads, "course changes uncoordinated." Cannot estimate new path to the Germans, it looked like confusion. In truth, it was choreography. But then, at dawn, an order came from London that would destroy the illusion. The Admiralty, fearing reports of heavy enemy surface ships, ordered PQ-17 to scatter, to abandon formation entirely. To Hanley, the command was madness. "Sir," he told the Samuel Chase's master, "we're about to turn order into real chaos." The merchant ships peeled away, each seeking safety alone. Without the rhythmic pattern to disguise them, they became easy targets. German aircraft and submarines tore into the broken line for 3 days straight. 24 of the 35 ships were sunk before reaching Soviet waters. Hanley survived. Samuel Chase limped into Archangel on July 19th, its deck streaked with oil and ice. The convoy had been a massacre. But it wasn't his system that failed. It was the decision to abandon it. When Horton read the reports, he was furious. "We'd found the answer," he told his staff, "and then we threw it away in panic." Still, even in tragedy, the results were undeniable. The few ships that had maintained staggered spacing during the scatter survived at twice the rate of those that broke formation. Horton filed his analysis with a note at the bottom. "Predictability kills. Rhythm saves." When Hanley finally returned to England, he found himself back in Horton's office, boots still crusted with Arctic salt. The Admiral asked him one question. "Does it work?" Hanley nodded. "Yes, sir, when we let it." The next convoy, WW51B, would be the real test. Horton now had the authority to enforce his doctrine fleet-wide. Hanley's impossible convoy trick was about to become official Royal Navy procedure. The next winter brought a different kind of cold, not just the Arctic kind that froze rigging and thickened oil, but the kind that settled into every officer who had watched PQ-17 burn. Admiral Horton knew that if the convoy system was to survive, it needed proof beyond theory. So in December 1942, the code-named convoy JW51B set out from Loch U toward Murmansk, 30 ships carrying everything from tanks to radar parts to boots. Its escorts were commanded by Captain Robert Sherbrooke, a calm mathematical man who trusted Horton's logic. Among his staff, that offset pattern was now known quietly as the Horton Formation. Hanley was back again, this time officially attached as a transport observer. He didn't wear rank. He didn't fit any uniform. But Horton wanted eyes aboard a merchant ship, someone who saw motion the way a driver sees terrain. JW51B wasn't a large convoy, but its enemy was. The Germans had positioned surface ships and submarines along its route, including the heavy cruisers Hipper and Lutzow, each carrying enough guns to shred a dozen freighters in a single engagement. Through the short Arctic day, Hanley noted the differences immediately. The convoy no longer moved in lockstep. Instead, each column shifted its course a few minutes out of phase, like a heartbeat with multiple pulses. When the lead escort turned 20 degrees starboard, the next column waited half a minute, then followed, and the next, and the next. To the naked eye, it was nothing. To a submarine commander watching through a periscope, it turned the ocean into a blur of intersecting wakes. 2 days north of Bear Island, German spotter planes appeared, black specks against the white cloud base. By midnight, the U-boats were closing in. The sonar men aboard the destroyer Achates picked up screws at multiple bearings but couldn't get a clear fix. The convoy's irregular motion had confused not just the Germans, but the escorts themselves. Sherbrooke had expected that. He'd drilled his captains to rely on radar more than instinct, to measure pattern by time rather than distance. At 0200, the first torpedoes struck the sea. One missed by less than 30 yards. The next 3 detonated in empty water. Wrong depth, wrong angle. The Germans' firing solutions were collapsing. From inside the merchant ships, it felt like luck. From the U-boats below, it looked like witchcraft. Hanley stood in the wheelhouse, tracing the convoy's motion on his pocket compass. The shifts weren't random. They followed a pulse. Every ship was slightly late, slightly early, never in the same place twice. He turned to the ship's master and said that the ocean now looked like traffic after a blizzard. No clean tracks to follow, only churned snow and wrong guesses. Then, just before dawn, the situation changed. German cruisers had picked up radar traces from the convoy. 2 heavy warships bore down through the ice fog, their guns capable of outranging any escort. The destroyers turned to intercept, laying smoke. In the chaos that followed, Sherbrooke was wounded and half his bridge crew killed, but the merchant ships held their erratic course. When the smoke cleared, the Germans were firing blind, their gunnery officers unable to keep pace with a formation that shifted every few minutes. They believed they were facing a much larger escort force. After 20 minutes of exchanging fire, the German fleet broke off and withdrew. It was one of the strangest naval engagements of the war. 30 merchant ships against an entire cruiser group, none of them sunk. When the convoy reached Murmansk, they counted 1 escort lost, none of the cargo ships destroyed. Statistically, it was a miracle. In truth, it was math. Horton's formation had worked exactly as Hanley's crude sketch had implied. Unpredictability, scaled to the rhythm of human reaction. In Liverpool, when Horton received the after-action report, he ran a finger down the loss column. 1 destroyer, 100 men, 30 ships delivered. It was the best ratio of the Arctic campaign. He sent a note to the Admiralty that read simply, "Convoy, motion, irregularity, confirmed effective. Recommend adoption for all northern routes." For Hanley, the victory didn't feel like triumph. He remembered the faces of the men on Achates, the smell of cordite in the ice fog, and how close they'd come to vanishing. But he also knew that something had shifted, not just in tactics, but in philosophy. They had stopped trying to be perfect machines and learned to be unpredictable ones. By spring, every convoy in the Arctic was sailing with the same pattern. Losses dropped by half. German commanders began reporting erratic convoy movement as a major barrier to successful attack. They tried to adjust, new firing tables, new timing patterns, but the rhythm kept changing. The trick wasn't a secret weapon. It was an idea born from one man who'd spent his life driving roads where predictability was death. By 1944, the Arctic convoys had turned into something closer to endurance trials than battles. The Germans still hunted them, but the odds had shifted. Every new group that sailed north did so with the Horton formation baked into its orders. No ship to follow another's exact rhythm. No 2 columns to zigzag in sync. The sea lanes, once predictable as railways, now pulsed with irregular life. From periscope depth, it was like watching ghosts. Sergeant William Hanley had long since been reassigned to shore duty, his convoy notes copied, standardized, and stripped of his name. He didn't mind. The system wasn't about credit. It was about survival. When he returned to Liverpool that spring, he could still hear the Arctic in his bones. The sound of ice cracking underfoot. The way every turn of a rudder made you wonder if the ocean was keeping score. In a drafty office overlooking the Mersey, he visited Admiral Horton one last time. Horton, gray and tired but satisfied, handed him a folder marked Convoy Statistics, North Russia, 1941 to 1944. Losses had fallen by 48% since the introduction of rhythmic staggering. It wasn't dramatic like a new weapon or a miracle ship, it was quiet math, proven by ships that arrived rather than sank. Hanley flipped through the figures, PQ-13, JW-51B, RA-55. The numbers told a story no photograph could. Convoys that should have lost half their ships were now losing 1 in 10. Merchant sailors who once joked about one-way tickets to Murmansk were making the round trip twice, sometimes 3 times. Even the Soviet liaison officers had noticed, writing to London, that the Western convoys have become most unpredictable. Horton smiled when he read that. Predictability had been the ocean's greatest ally. Now it was the enemy's. On the other side of Europe, German U-boat captains were coming to the same conclusion. Reports captured after the war reveal a tone that shifts from confidence to disbelief. One commander described the new Allied formations as erratic convoys which do not hold course long enough to fire upon. Another, after 3 failed attacks in a week, wrote simply, "They are learning our rhythm faster than we can change it." By mid-1944, German Admiralty ordered its wolf packs to avoid Arctic waters altogether. The risk had become too high. They redeployed to the Bay of Biscay, hoping for easier prey. The northern route, once the deadliest corridor of the war, had become almost routine. Convoys sailed, fought weather more than torpedoes, and arrived. In an ocean that had eaten so many men, survival itself became the victory. Hanley didn't stay for the celebrations. He left the service quietly, back to his trucks and highways. When people asked what he'd done during the war, he said he helped organize deliveries. It was true enough. Few ever knew that those deliveries had crossed oceans instead of states. Years later, historians studying the Arctic campaign would find his name in an obscure logistics report. A single line under Civilian Observations Incorporated. They wouldn't know that his idea came from watching convoys of trucks snake through icy passes in Alaska, or that he'd seen the same pattern of danger there. The second truck always hit the same patch of ice as the first. Change the rhythm, break the pattern, and more men lived. It was so simple, it barely sounded like strategy. But simplicity is what endures. When the war ended, the convoy data became part of Allied naval doctrine. Every ocean escort school taught it as a case study, how randomness, properly measured, could defeat precision. Horton retired a year later, writing in his final report that the strength of a system is often found not in its order, but in its controlled disorder. Hanley's old compass ended up in a drawer, its brass tarnished, its glass fogged from years of cold. He never knew that his idea, born on a frozen highway and tested in the Arctic, had gone on to influence not just convoy tactics, but radar jamming, air patrol formations, even anti-submarine flight routes. Chaos, he had learned, could be engineered. The convoys that followed kept moving north through ice and silence. Ships that once died by the dozen now vanished rarely, and the ocean that had once been ruled by mathematics had been defeated by a truck driver's instinct. In the war's long list of triumphs built from machines, steel, and invention, perhaps none was quieter or more human than the one that taught the Atlantic how to lose its rhythm. It began as an idea on a sheet of paper, and by the time the war ended, that single change in timing had saved thousands of lives and millions of tons of cargo. The Arctic still took what it wanted, but never again on schedule. Thanks for listening till the end. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. Subscribe my channel if you like this type of content.